Welcome, everyone. I'm Lorenzo De Carli from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. Ours is a position paper, and therefore this is not going to be a technical talk. Rather, we hope to use this occasion to call the attention of the IoT security community on what we believe is an important but overlooked research area. So home IoT devices such as smart thermostats, locks, cameras, and really any appliance which is internet connected and computation enabled holds great promise to simplify our life, enabling things such as controlling our home from away, automating household chores, and making our homes more energy efficient. But we also know that many IoT devices come with poor security, which may hinder those promises and their deployment. Security news are literally littered with headlines detailing things such as internet-connected baby monitors that can be hacked, smart locks that can be opened by attackers with very limited skills, hubs which are called private keys or passwords, and so forth. So given this problematic situation, there's been great activity in the academic IoT security community in securing IoT devices. So there are several directions for this. One is, of course, designing better devices by performing things such as more robust authentication, access control, more robust verification of software to remove vulnerabilities. The problem with those approaches is that first, they only going to affect future generations of IoT devices and therefore only be effective in the long term. And also historically, we have observed that manufacturers have limited incentives in improving the security of their devices. The second direction, which is also being very popular then, is that of detecting attacks based on IoT devices by analyzing the network traffic generated and received by those devices. Talking about attacks, such as ones where an attacker takes control of devices to spy on users or join IoT botnets and similar ones. Now, the other advantage of the network-based approach is that beyond being easy to deploy, is that we can leverage experience in intrusion detection from decades of work on enterprise network security. Therefore, in the rest of this talk, we're going to focus on this style of technique, this style of detection. So how does it work specifically? Generally speaking, the idea is that we're going to install some type of agent on a gateway, which has access both to device communication and device-to-cloud communications, and run some type of threat detection algorithms on the traffic. Which algorithms? The most proposed techniques, the most popular techniques use a combination of traditional signature-based intrusion detection and anomaly detection. Anomaly detection techniques tend to be more popular now because they work in some form even on encrypted traffic, which is common. There is then a host of other techniques that, while not performing detection per se, aim at providing useful context for detection, such as fingerprinting the devices to discover the type, manufacturer, and so on. Now, this is the status quo. Our observation is that first, most techniques that are not proposed for IoT network security originate in the enterprise security domain. And therefore, we're still analyzing the results and the performance of those techniques in a similar way by looking at things such as true positive rate, false positive rate, F1, and so forth. Those are useful aspects, but they don't tell the whole story. Sorry. That's because, so working enterprise security assumes that there is a user, such as a network administrator, security officer, which is available to look at the output of the network security tool and make sense of it, deciding what is a false positive or a true positive, and take appropriate countermeasures if an attack is detected. Now, in home IoT security, this is a problematic assumption that does not work anymore because no such expert user exists in a typical IoT home deployment. The typical IoT device owner is not a network security expert, cannot make sense on their own of the output of the warnings generated by a threat detection algorithm. So how do we solve this problem? A first immediate answer may be, well, if the owner cannot help us in managing security, then we should build tools that work without user involvement. We should build algorithms that can work in a fully automated fashion without the presence of an expert user, such as a network administrator. Our claim is that this is not a good idea. We claim that network security techniques designed for home networks should aim at keeping the human in the loop, both because it is necessary in order to design high-quality network security tools, and also because it is a good design. And I elaborate on both claims in a second. The other thing we want to highlight is that once we decide that we want to keep the human in security loop, at least in regard to home IoT networks, how to appropriately involve the users who is typically non-technical in network security management, it is a hard problem and raises a number of research questions, a few of which I'll discuss later. Let's begin by answering the question, why do we need to involve the users? The first answer is functional. Existing detectors are just not accurate enough, even very accurate ones. And this happens because of the well-known base rate fallacy. Since attacks are relatively rare events, most of the alarms generated by a detector are going to be false positives. The relevant parameter here is the Bayesian detection rate as defined by Axelson, which is the probability that there is an intrusion given an alarm. In other words, if the system generates a warning, what is the probability that there was an actual attack? Now, the problem is that a detector which has low Bayesian detection rate should not be enabled to make autonomous decisions, such as blocking addresses or dropping flows, because most of the times it's going to be making those decisions based on noisy signals and may deploy countermeasures that are not necessary or even disruptive and may prevent devices from working. As a case study, let's look at the Kitsune anomaly detector. Kitsune is the state-of-the-art in IoT-oriented anomaly detection, presented at NDSS 2018, if I remember correctly, complex technique that leverages ensembles of autoencoders, so recent advance in machine learning, and comprehensive evaluation, which looks at the system in presence of a number of IoT-relevant attacks. Now, the evaluation is detailed enough to allow us to compute the Bayesian detection rate for all those attacks. And to put them in context, the results are very impressive for an anomaly detection system. But if you look here at the Bayesian detection rate in different cases, which is between 1 and 0, we can see that even in the best cases, it remains quite low. So allowing a system to deploy network countermeasures to resolve security incidents based on those type of numbers is risk resulting in situations where most of the time we're actually reacting to attacks that do not exist, with all the problems that follow. Second consideration is more philosophical. Why should we involve the user? Because an important tenet in the design of human-centered technology is that users should retain control of their devices and understanding of what they do. Why is this so important? If we look at years of work in human-computer interaction focused on user perception of computer security, we see that this perception is very problematic. Studies have found that frustration, concern, difficulty, and other expressions of discomfort. So do we really want to make things worse? Do we really want to make the perception of security by users worse by deploying systems that make a large number of incorrect decisions, which end up disrupting the functioning of the devices? Now, if, as I hope, I'm beginning to convince you that perhaps users should be involved in the security loop, at least as it pertains IoT home networks, then the question is, how can we reason about user involvement? One of our proposals is a general abstraction for network monitoring systems that incorporate the user in the loop. These abstractions incorporate a traditional network monitoring component, and this is where most of the work in this space ends. But we also define a component which we call a security message broker, which receives events from the network monitoring component, produce understandable explanation for the users, and direct this explanation to the user. Now, the interesting thing in a home IoT network is that IoT devices themselves can be used to present information to the user. And these significantly extend the possibilities of interactions. It gives us the ability of producing, for example, audio message with smart speakers, or phone notifications, or video notifications. So really, there are ample opportunities that should be studied. Now, to give some more concreteness to the idea of this system and scenarios in which it could be useful, I'm going to narrate a scenario which I took from the paper. So consider a household. The people in the household are beginning to go to sleep when the IoT monitoring component detects unusual burst of activity from an adjustable home monitoring camera in the living room. Given that the smart speaker and televisions are off, the message broker decides to reach the user by a smartphone notification. The user receives the notification and confirms that they are not currently operating the camera. Because the camera appears to be active without the user using it, the inspector then informs the user that the camera may have been hacked. The user suspects that this event is related to an abusive former partner who no longer lives in the household and disables the camera. So nothing in this scenario is particularly far-fetched. IoT devices have been used for domestic abuse, smart home cameras have been hacked. So these are realistic scenarios which also evidence that there are a number of research questions at the boundary between the monitoring system and the user. I elaborate a few questions in this slide, and I'm not going to read all of them, but at least I'm going to point a few of them which I believe are particularly interesting. For example, if we communicate warnings using different modes, such as audio versus text, do we receive the same attention for the user? Are there modes of communication that are always superior to other ones? Or considering that the user oftentimes does not have security expertise to put warnings in context, how can we formulate notifications to ensure that the user understands the situation without creating undue stress? Or can we produce generalized warnings, or the warnings and interaction need to be adjusted based on demographics, such as, for example, the age of the user? Those are all interesting questions for which, unfortunately, I do not have the answer, but I believe those are all important questions that should be investigated. Given this, how do we move forward? As a first step in this space, we designed and deployed a testbed for the evaluation of IoT security interactions. This testbed includes a first component that enables the experimenter to generate simulated warnings and requests for information directed towards a user, the subject. In the future, of course, we hope to be able to plug actual network monitoring system in place of an experimenter. It then includes a software component, a message broker, which receives notifications and decides how to best reach the user based on the available active IoT devices in the network. And finally, a number of backends for different types of IoT devices, which can actually be used to display notification and receive user feedback. And we build backends for Android smartphones, smart televisions, and smart speakers. Beyond designing the infrastructure and building the software, we actually deployed such a testbed in our institution, and we used it for a preliminary user study. The goal of this user study was to assess the viability of the testbed and also assess high-level user attitudes towards a system that incorporates the user in the management of home network security. While the sample size is too small for quantitative evaluation, we outline here a brief qualitative evaluation of participant responses. The sample was fairly evenly split between users who would consider using this type of system at home and those who had some concerns. The most recurring concerns will be familiar to those working on usable security. Concern about false positives and their workflow being disrupted by false alarms, concerns about the security of the monitoring system itself. What happens if an attacker abuses the monitoring system to carry an attack? And finally, what we're most interested about, the understandability of warnings. How can we produce warnings which are understandable to users? To conclude, in this talk, we claim that work on network monitoring algorithms for the home has so far ignored the user. And we believe that involving the users is necessary for successful deployment of IoT security. Finally, our preliminary testbed-based evaluation suggests that there is user interest in this type of systems, but also highlight a number of open problems and research directions. This concludes my talk, and I'll be happy to take questions.